Is George Bush feeling the heat on global warming? The politics of climate change, next on the Body Politic. Good evening and welcome to the Body Politic. I'm Michael Bernstein, a professor of history and dean of arts and humanities here at the University of California, San Diego. Global warming, what was once called a theory, is now considered fact by the scientific community and even the leaders of both political parties. Al Gore, who's been warning about climate change for years, turned the issue into box office gold with his movie An Inconvenient Truth. And President Bush, a one-time skeptic of global warming, is in Germany this week, urging the Group of 8 industrialized nations to set long-term goals to cut greenhouse gas emissions. So what changed? Why is global warming now at the top of America's agenda? For some insight on that, we turn to Tony Haymet, the director of the Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and Thad Kousser, a political scientist on the faculty here at UCSD. Welcome to both of you. Thanks for joining us. Tony, let me start with you. Former Vice President Al Gore was here in San Diego just a couple of weeks ago. Why did he come? What did he have to tell us?
Well, he came to give his slideshow, which I think he did in fantastic fashion. It was a carefully managed visit by his people, but we also got a little time to talk science with him before that visit. And he also opened the new climate exhibit at the Birch Aquarium.
Gore refers frequently in the movie to Roger Revelle, the celebrated oceanographer, once the chief campus officer here at UCSD. Could you explain the relationship between the former vice president and Roger Revelle?
Sure. Well, Roger Revelle's a leading figure in oceanography, and among many things, in the mid-50s he began to be concerned about CO2 and indeed more broadly what human beings are doing to the planet. And Roger had the great foresight to hire Charles David Keeling to come to this campus. And that's the start of the definitive measurement of CO2, the uncontested data set that proves that we're having an impact on CO2.
Carbon dioxide, which is believed to be responsible for this phenomenon of global warming.
Exactly, that the natural CO2 warms the planet Earth, but now we've added another one CO2 molecule for every 3 that existed before. And Dave Keeling's measurement that's been going on almost for 50 years and continued on by Scripps after Dave passed away is the primary data set that shows that global warming is happening.
David Keeling, in calculating this increase in the carbon dioxide concentrations, came up with a curve, a graphic representation of his work.
It's very
the Keeling curve.
Exactly. That's an iconic curve that's at the Academy of Science in Washington next to Darwin's finches. It's a measurement. It's not a calculation. It's a very precise measurement of the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. And Dave figured out where that measurement should be done, at Mauna Loa in Hawaii, to get away from the day-to-day fluctuations of urban living. So Dave, inspired by Roger Revelle, really started this business. And the relationship, to answer your question, Roger Revelle was the director of Scripps Institution of Oceanography, had a hand in founding this great campus, UCSD. When he stepped down as director, went to Harvard briefly for just a couple of years. And one of the students he taught there was Al Gore.
It's Al Gore. Now, just returning to Keeling now. Now, Ralph Keeling was here when Vice President Gore came on campus, correct?
That's right. Ralph Keeling is a distinguished atmospheric
scientist. Have a picture. I know we have a picture of Gore with Ralph Keeling. So
exactly.
What are they doing?
Well, in that picture, they're taking a CO2 measurement by the protocol that Ralph's father Dave invented. So that these CO2 measurements could be done reproducibly for 50 years. And so Ralph is a distinguished scientist in his own right. He's on the faculty here at UCSD, but he's also Dave's son and works in a very similar field. He studies the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere, which, not to alarm anybody, is going down very slightly.
It's also going down. So, and along with this interaction with Ralph Keeling, there was a special reception for Al Gore. I understand Ellen Revelle, Roger Revelle's widow, was present. Roger died in 1991, so this must have been a special reunion.
It was a great day. I mean, Ellen is a very special friend of ours at Scripps. We see her frequently. And she and her family just endowed the Roger Revelle Chair in climate science. And
this will allow you to recruit a leading climate scientist
add yet another
to the institution.
To our great climate group, and a very generous bequest, the largest chair we've ever had. And Al Gore announced it at this very tightly controlled reception.
After the visit at Scripps and at the aquarium at Scripps, Gore came up the hill, as we like to say, to the general campus, and he gave this updated version of Inconvenient Truth. As I understand it, there were almost 4,000 people in the hall. Can you tell us how the presentation was updated? What was new, and was his message well received in this gathering?
Well, I think it's fair to say it was well received. Some of the undergraduates that I'm helping to teach this quarter thought it was a great event. I thought it was great. Some of the slides that our scientists had given Al Gore at 3 o'clock were in the presentation by 5:30. So there was a lot new.
Quick turnaround.
A quick turnaround. I mean, it's very impressive that someone who's not a scientist, and a politician and I guess a movie star, is able to argue with us over the science, but then incorporate new things as they become available.
Now, I also understand that Gore singled out Naomi Oreskes, a professor of history. She focuses her work on the history of science. She's done a lot of work on the global warming debate and the development of the idea among the scientific community. Can you tell me what Gore had to say about that?
Naomi's one of our hidden treasures here at UCSD, but very famous in the climate field for studying the peer-reviewed literature over a long period of time, what had actually been written and published in the most authoritative journals about climate change. We hear a lot about this so-called debate, but Naomi was actually the one that went out and said, well, where are the peer-reviewed articles on the other side? And to cut a long story short, she didn't find them.
Right, so she was able to demonstrate that global warming indeed, as we mentioned in the lead-in to the program, is now considered scientific fact. It's not being debated by the authorities.
We have, as a community, reached a consensus. And Roger Revelle understood this probably in '57, and Dave Keeling's measurements showed it clearly by 1965. So we at Scripps have been working pretty hard for 40 years, and it's really key people like Al Gore, and I must say Governor Schwarzenegger, who've really turned this debate around.
Well, and as you say, the debate now having been resolved, nonetheless, there are political axes to grind, suggesting that people remain confused about global warming. Is that true? Let's turn to Thad here. Is it true, Thad, that there's a demonstrable confusion in the voting public about this issue?
I think there is, because most Americans don't learn about global warming from scientists, right? We don't read Science and Nature. We learn about global warming from politicians. And you see a difference in what politicians on either side of the aisle are saying. Republicans generally across the nation have been saying that the science isn't in, there's still a debate. And so Republicans generally across the nation are less supportive of moves to counter global warming. But in California, where Republican Arnold Schwarzenegger has made this an issue, Republicans in California are now convinced.
The polling data are quite vivid. CBS, New York Times poll recently, 70% of Democrats accept the argument about global warming and the need to respond. 30% of Republicans. I mean, why is it such a partisan issue, as you say, as distinct from a scientific versus layman's issue?
It comes from leadership. In California, those figures are 70% of Democrats believe it's an issue, 62% of Republicans believe it's something that needs to be addressed. So it comes from our leadership. But there's also another side of that, which is responding to global warming may be painful in the short run, right? It's going to require some costs and some investments, and it's something that the business community has been hesitant. It's also going to require more governmental regulation. So Republicans are also less convinced it's a problem, but less happy about the solutions as well. That drives the divide.
Well, looking at the broader policy issues, you mentioned the regional issues here in California. President Bush is in Germany this week. He appears to have revised his position on global warming considerably. He's calling on world leaders, including China and India, these rapidly growing economies, to establish goals to reduce their greenhouse emissions. Is this a significant move by the president? If so, why?
Well, I think there are two things in which this is not a major move. The first is that there's an emphasis on goals rather than caps. This is something that the Bush administration has favored domestically with environmental
not an absolute limit,
voluntary
but just a sort of
rather than a regulatory
right.
response, which has drawn critique from environmentalists. And the second is involving not just Western Europe and Japan and the United States in combating global warming, but involving developing nations. That's something the Bush administration has continuously called for. In fact, that's a large reason why the Bush administration has opposed the Kyoto protocols.
So the Kyoto Protocol, which of course was developed in 1997, implementation began in 99. There are about 160 countries now that have signed on board, but not the United States. President Bush was not willing to make that commitment. What the president has discussed in Germany this week would not replace the Kyoto protocols.
It wouldn't, and it's also not going to. It's not the rejuvenation of the Kyoto Protocol. It's President Bush's signal of a move towards a global take that will involve both developing and developed nations. I think more in combating greenhouse gas emissions.
Tony, do you think this important distinction Thad's made between goals and caps? Do you think there's any prospect for an international agreement on caps, on a explicit regulation of emissions?
In the scientific community, we try and work backwards from the end, and I think the end game is China and the US making a deal. And that's what it comes down to. I think Europe has already shown leadership. Europe's very happy with the idea of a cap and trade system. And in the whole natural resource management business, when we talk about international fisheries, we're very happy with cap and trade systems.
And what do you mean by cap and trade? There's some ability to negotiate these
There's a certain number of fish in the sea. If we catch more than a certain limit, we're going to kill the population, whether it's cod or lobsters in California. And so then it introduces a tradable commodity. Something like that in CO2 seems very logical to the scientific community. The trouble is it's not something that the current administration seems very comfortable with.
But your point is that without the major players involved, this case US and China, the rest of it isn't really going to make a big difference.
Well, it's even more important that because the other players seem pretty amenable. I mean, Europe's a seventh of the problem, and yet they've pretty much got themselves.
Right.
I mean, it's always interesting to see that Europe plays the card. Of course, France has 80% of its electricity from nuclear power.
Right.
So Europe's pretty well positioned to meet any caps. So, of course, every country or a group of countries is playing their strong
And the frustration and political dilemmas for the Chinese, presumably, and even in India, are that rapid growth is transforming these nations, but to accept caps of some sort, as Thad said earlier, would potentially slow that down.
We're saying do what we say, don't do what we do.
Don't do what we do. Yeah. Well, the received wisdom was always that the traction of environmental regulation was sort of inversely related to economic performance, as economists like to say, counter-cyclical. So the economy's doing well, people would be more amenable to the idea. The economy doesn't do well, the focus is on jobs, the need to generate income, so don't talk about regulation for environmental protection. But that seems to be changing in the U.S. now, right, Thad?
Well, I think with global warming, it's clear what the economic costs are of inaction. With Hurricane Katrina, if global warming is contributing to extreme weather events, it's going to cost people. It's going to have a real effect on people's everyday lives. Environmentalism is no longer a luxury good. It's something that you need to do to protect your children's economic future. Interesting
assessment of the collective costs, independent of what's happening in your company or in your household. Let's look at the political viability. I'd be interested in both of your opinions. Political viability of some of the ideas that have been put forward. Mandatory limits on CO2 emissions. Anywhere to go there, Thad, as you see the polls and read the Congress at the present time?
Sure. I mean, this is what Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger signed in California. It's been incredibly popular in California. It's garnered national, international headlines, and it's really mandatory limits are really the only way to go in many people's mind to actually do something effective.
Is there a chance for success with the Schwarzenegger initiative? I mean, it is after all an initiative by a governor, not a president.
It's important if you're going to have mandatory caps to do it early. Because what Governor Schwarzenegger understands is there's a great opportunity there. If you're the one that's developing the little businesses and the big businesses that are going to develop alternative energies, then you can export that to other states and other countries. So I think
he's trying to position California as a lead in this area.
And California has always been. I mean, we were the ones that invented catalytic converters. And when everyone in Detroit said, we can't make them for California, they'll never catch on. You go to China, every automobile has a catalytic converter. So California has always been a leader, and I think the governor very brilliantly played into that leadership role.
And again, with respect to other policy ideas, more investment in alternative fuel research. You see a future there? You see traction for that idea?
Absolutely. I think this has been the one thing that the people on both sides of the aisle, President Bush, Governor Schwarzenegger, has made that a big part of their environmental program because it doesn't have clear cost. There's some government investment, but it's government investment that could really turn a profit eventually and help the economy. And with gas prices continue to get higher and higher.
I was going to say there are actually two issues here. One is to develop alternative fuels that reduce the CO2 footprint in combustion engines. The other would be to decrease reliance on expensive sources of fossil fuels.
Yeah, I think we have to be careful about the ethanol issue. I read recently it's increased the price of both tortillas and beer, and I think most politicians don't want to be on that.
Well, that's because the crops are used to develop the fuel rather than to produce these consumption goods.
So I think it's clear that ethanol, at least with the current production mechanisms, is great in terms of energy independence, but I don't think it's going to make a dent in the greenhouse problem.
Interesting. So there could actually be a divergence of interest in one, the energy dependency issue, and two, environmental protection. Nuclear energy. This is a hot button item, certainly in the United States. You mentioned earlier, Tony, the French, of course, have made major commitments to relying on nuclear energy. You see a future there in the U.S. case to deal with the CO2 problem?
I think it has to be on the table. I mean, in the U.S., we've regulated ourselves out of even thinking about nuclear energy. But it may be that, you know, we're a wealthy enough society that we can kind of jump immediately to renewable sources of energy. But you look at China, William K. Riley, when he was here, he was the head of EPA under Bush 1, a very astute observer of world energy systems. He told me that China opened 138 coal-fired power stations in calendar year last year. You ask yourself, do you want those, you know, CO2 producing coal-fired plants, or do you want nuclear capability? Maybe the best, safest French technology. These are the questions that the world has to address, I think, as a community.
Putting it on the world stage is politically doable. I think increasing the number of nuclear facilities and also the nuclear waste that's produced by them needing to have sites for storage in the U.S., probably too hot a political issue for anyone to really stake their career on. I wouldn't want to be the person who ran on nukes the next time there's a problem.
Another possibility, fuel efficiency standards. Perhaps a hot button item in those communities that make cars for a living, increasing the standards for cars and trucks and so forth, other vehicles. Once tried, I mean, any future there?
Well, I mean, it's a question of leadership. I mean, the rest of the world is soon going to have 60 miles per gallon vehicles. You know, they already exist. The governor of Oregon has mandated that the whole Oregon government fleet will be that. How quickly we can, in the rest of the United States, can change our way of thinking and come around to that will determine, I think, whether we're the leaders in this business or whether we're followers.
The public does seem to be interested in hybrid vehicles and so forth, and although they're a bit more expensive these days, presumably the price will come down with more innovation.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the market is driving the biggest change in corporate average fuel economy has come through consumer demand as gas prices have continued to go up. But there is also a governmental. Just this week, the Democrats in Congress were holding hearings on making Detroit produce more fuel-efficient cars.
Tony had mentioned, you know, cap and trade. Is there a political future there? I mean, you know, often we hear various sides of the political argument that this creates an enormous bureaucracy, further regulation of economic activity and enterprise. But
well, the cap and trade idea is a way to use market mechanisms to reduce pollution as cheaply as possible, and it's really less. If you're going to regulate, if you're going to have caps, allowing tradable credits is the less regulatory response. But it has a downside because it can lead to more pollution in areas that are poorer and areas that have more minorities. It raises the specter of the environmental justice movement, and so it's actually caused some controversy and some opposition on the left.
There does appear to be that problem that poorer communities are less able to protect themselves politically from this.
And there's also the issue of how widespread is this tradable system? Is there a single system for the whole world? Which seems logical because it's CO2 lives in the atmosphere for 100 years, and yet you could make the same argument about currencies. You know, we have the euro, we have the dollar. There's, you know, sound reasons why we have segmented the financial mechanisms in the world, and the same may end up being true of tradable systems. There may be a CO2 block in South America and in the Asia Pacific and so on. So I think all these things are under active debate and discussion.
Well, you raise an interesting point there, Tony. Would there be a logic to having certain regions trading credits because of the nature of climate movement on the globe?
Well, there are, you know, nations that have more ability to sequester carbon, to take carbon out of the system, and perhaps those nations should be rewarded for that. Mm-hmm. You know, there's also movements that think we should, you know, keep it all in San Diego County, and that we, should somehow be carbon neutral within the borders of our little part of the world. So there's a lot of different levels of thinking on this.
And there's also been a sort of, this would be a more blunt device, presumably, than the cap and trade. There's been a proposal for a so-called carbon tax. I presume this would be just an excise tax on any activity that involves a CO2 footprint. Has there been any analysis of the potential of these proposals?
Well, that's a competing proposal, and
Like a flat tax, I guess.
yeah, I mean, you know, it's all a question of the balance of carrots and sticks. I mean, if you're going to give people a CO2 allowance, a lot of people say, well, why should we give it to the big energy companies? Why don't we give it to human beings and let, at the human being level, be the tradable partner? You know, so maybe I'm allowed 2 tons of carbon a year, and it's up to me whether I fly to Europe or, you know, pot around on my bicycle in La Jolla. So there's a lot of social justice issues. There's a lot of big business issues. It's going to be a tough one to solve.
We have a little time left. Looking to the future, my question for you, Tony, would be, what are the prospects? Can we start to get on top of this problem and avoid being underwater all around the world? And Thad, how do you see the political momentum here in the States with respect to concern about global warming and environment?
Well, first of all, we can solve this problem. I mean, we've caught it early enough. It's a question that a wealthy society like California, a clever society like California, we can really address it. It's just a question of, you know, living within our energy budget, which we're skilled at doing.
And Thad, politically, we're heading into a presidential year. You know, the sweepstakes has started.
Absolutely, but it's an interesting presidential year because we may see both major party nominees being quite active on this issue. If John McCain's the nominee, he's been out in front as wanting to do environmental protection. This is going to be one of those issues in politics where we're going to look back in 10 years and say, my gosh, I can't believe there's a partisan divide over this issue. I think there's going to be a growing consensus that this is a problem and a growing consensus that not doing anything will cost us.
And you think it's possible then that across, you know, class divide, age divide, regional divide, there would be a commitment to embracing regulations and costs that might in fact have direct economic impacts on people's
welfare? There will be fights over how to spread the pain and how to do this technically, but I think there will be a consensus that something needs to be done, that global warming is a real problem and that we do have the ability and need to address it.
Very grateful to you both. Thank you. Tony Haymet of Scripps Institution of Oceanography, and Thad Kousser, a political scientist at UC San Diego. Next, an introduction to Paul Drake. We'll be right back. My next guest is Paul Drake. He is a political scientist who studies contemporary Latin America and for the last 12 years has served as Dean of Social Sciences at UC San Diego. I have asked him here because he will replace me as host of this program starting in September. Paul, welcome. I understand you've been on sabbatical this year from your dean duties. How's your sabbatical gone? Did you put your time to good use?
I think sabbaticals are the best thing in academia, but I hadn't had one in 11 years, so I've been hiding in an undisclosed location and trying to finish a book.
And what's the book about?
The book is about the history of democracy in Latin America. I'm trying to combine my background in both history and political science. It's not quite done, but I made a lot of progress.
You know, you originally trained as an historian, right?
That's right. I have a PhD from Stanford. I'm as confused as you are. I'm an historian in the political science department. You're an economist in a history department. So it just shows how interdisciplinary and unscrupulous UCSD can be.
We are on campus. Well, best of luck in finishing your project in your undisclosed location, but indeed your sabbatical research leave will soon come to an end and you'll return to your leadership of the Division of Social Sciences at UCSD. Are you ready to come back? What's on tap there?
Well, no, of course I'm not ready to come back, but I will come back. And I see actually all of this closely connected. I think studying Latin American politics is good preparation for academic administration. I would recommend it to you in the future, actually, because teaches you how to deal with budget crises, student uprisings, and attempted coups.
Right. I imagine that'll be on offer where I'm headed.
Well, Michael, let me ask you about where you're headed. You've been a friend and colleague for 2 decades, a fellow dean for 2 years. I always thought anybody who left UCSD was a little bit insane, but I gather you have an attractive offer, and you're going to leave us to go to one of the better private universities in the South, Tulane. I've been there many times. Tell us a little bit about the university and your new job.
Well, you're right. UCSD is a wonderful place. It's not an easy place to leave, but I've been offered the opportunity to serve as Tulane's next Vice President for Academic Affairs and Provost. My role there will be to serve as chief academic officer and essentially to work with the deans of the various schools at Tulane, the dean of the undergraduate college, the dean of law, the dean of medicine, the dean of architecture, dean of public health, and so forth, dean of business.
So your position is analogous to our senior vice chancellor for academic affairs?
Absolutely, that's right. It's the same position, really, and my responsibilities, like the senior vice chancellor's responsibilities here at UCSD, are academic recruitment and advancement of faculty colleagues in the various divisions and schools, budgetary planning, academic planning, and of course to serve as a key collaborator with the president of the university. Sure.
Let me ask you a little bit about the academic side. I have some friends that are in the departments at Tulane, both in history and political science. After Katrina hit the campus, some have stayed, some have left. It seems to me, in a way, you're taking a wonderful job, but a very risky one. What are you going to be able to do to recruit and keep faculty under these conditions?
Oh, it's a great question. Tulane, like all of the Gulf region, and in particular, like all of New Orleans, went through an incredible ordeal when Hurricane Katrina came ashore in August of 2005. The Tulane is divided between two campuses. Its main campus, or general campus, as we'd call it here, is basically back from the storm. And I think that makes recruiting faculty to the general campus now easier with each passing week and month, because things are getting back to normal. The downtown campus, as it's called, the health sciences campus, is where the medical school and the School of Public Health and Tropical Medicine are located in the central business district of New Orleans. Devastated by the storm, the main hospital was destroyed. And of course, we'll be working very hard to restore the medical school completely in its operations, but that's going to take a bit longer, and that makes the challenges of recruiting and retaining faculty a little more difficult.
Well, it sounds very exciting. You've been involved at UCSD in building up the campus as it's growing. At Tulane, it sounds like you'll be rebuilding a bit to try and put it back.
That's right. That's a good comparison. Tulane, the leadership at Tulane, almost immediately after the storm hit, started planning for renewal, and indeed articulated a general plan called the Renewal Plan. It's a very bold and principled plan to reorganize faculties and schools, make some tough budgetary choices, and invest in the future. And in that sense, some very difficult decisions have already been made, and I've been challenged coming on board this July to begin the implementation of the plan with commitment to its core principles, which is, to pursue excellence in everything that Tulane does and to sustain the future of the university for generations to come. Tulane does face the dilemma that all good universities face. It can be excellent in anything it chooses, but it can't be excellent at everything it chooses.
Right.
So, Paul, thank you very much for taking a little time to ask me about my future and for joining us here, and I'm very grateful to you for taking up the reins here with the Body Politic. And
well, Michael, thank you. I feel I'm going to be filling some big shoes, and
gonna have fun.
Tulane's gain is our loss, and you'll be missed.
Thank you so much, Paul. And thanks to all of you who've been watching and supporting the Body Politic during my 3-year tenure as host, and I wish my successor, Paul Drake, the very best of luck. And I will be watching on UCTV from New Orleans. I'm Michael Bernstein. Good night.